is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 196, covering the week of November 18th through November 22nd, 2019. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE, abbevilleinstitute.org. You can see those social media buttons at the top of the page. While you're there, give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook. You get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also, don't forget to download our free mobile app. Just go to your app store, whether it's on Apple device or a non-Apple mobile device, and search for Abbeville Institute. It'll pull up the app. Download that, and you've got the Institute on the go. You've got all of our audio lectures, of course, our podcasts, and mobile access to the website. Also, don't forget that we exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like the Abbeville Institute, if you like what we do, you like our conferences, our podcast, our website, all the things that we do, we exist on your generous contributions. So you can make a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law. Just go to abbevilleinstitute.org. You'll see a tab that says support. Click on that. You'll have donor options. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. And again, all of your contributions go to supporting our mission, which is exploring what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Also, you can get your Abbeville Institute apparel if you click on that support tab and then click on shop after that. You'll be taken to our online store where you can get your embroidered Abbeville Institute apparel. It's not screen printed, it's embroidered stuff, so it'll last a long time. Golf shirts, t-shirts, hats, golf towels, great stuff. Fleece, it's getting wintertime now. In the South, all you really need is a fleece in much of the South, so get a fleece with the Abbeville Institute logo on it. It's great stuff, and of course you advertise at the same time, and people are going to ask you, hey, what is that Abbeville Institute thing? And you can tell them. All right, all that said, and don't forget, if you like this podcast and you like our material, share it on social media, rate it on iTunes or Apple Podcasts now, what it's called. Anywhere you get your podcast, rate it there because people do see that and then they're going to listen to it because of good ratings. So all that's very important to spread the message about the Institute. All right, so let's talk about the material for the week. And I think we had a really good week now. Just one minor note, we will have a couple of pieces next week, which is Thanksgiving week, but we will not have a podcast during Thanksgiving week. So the next time you'll hear my voice is the week after Thanksgiving, and we only have a couple of more after that. So we will be wrapping up for the year before Christmas. So we'll get to almost 200 episodes. In fact, I think the way it's going to shake out is episode 200 will be the first episode of 2020, which will be pretty cool if you think about it. So we're going to wrap up, I believe, with episode 199 for the year of 2019. All right, so we're on episode 196, though. We got to get through this. So let's talk about the material we had for the week. First and foremost, I think one of the themes that we had this week is nationalism and the disease of nationalism. In fact, the piece on Wednesday by John Devaney, who is one of our fine scholars, one of Clyde Wilson's former students, John Devaney wrote a little piece on the Constitution entitled Poison Under the Wings. And really, that quote, he didn't come up with that. That was Patrick Henry saying this. And essentially, the point is that the Constitution was doomed from the beginning. Nationalism was already problematic long before we had, of course, the Lincolnian America, the 20th century. Nationalism really is the disease, the detriment to the original Federal Republic. And the so-called anti-federalists, which were really the real federalists, realized this. They understood that the real issue in Philadelphia was not large state versus small state. It was federalism versus nationalism. And this comes out in the debates. This comes out in the debates during ratification. It comes out in the debates at the Philadelphia Convention. And men like Patrick Henry and George Mason in Virginia, And also in the North, I mean, you had those who were opposed to this strong central authority in the North, even people like Sam Adams and John Hancock, and a host of others, were certain. And if you look at North Carolina, people like Wiley Jones, for example, these people were certain, these men were certain, that the Constitution was going to destroy the states. Now, the important thing to say about that is that they were sold a bill of goods on the promise that it wouldn't, meaning that those who were in favor of the Constitution consistently said that this Constitution is not going to destroy the power of the states, that the states are still the primary vehicle in this general government. It was a general government, an important distinction to make, a general government for general purposes only, and by general purposes they meant commerce and defense, that all other issues would be left to the states, and that the central authority had no powers not delegated to it. I mean, this was the way that James Wilson of Pennsylvania responded to George Mason's criticisms of the document. And, of course, this is what James Wilson of Pennsylvania said in his very famous State House Yard speech just a couple of weeks after the Philadelphia Convention had produced the document and sent it to the states for ratification. This was no secret. Even Alexander Hamilton sold the document in New York this way. So, when you look at what happened, Henry is prophetic because he said, look, I mean, what's going to happen is that we are going to have a despotic central authority. And I like this particular paragraph from Dr. Devaney. It says this, quote, "The predicament for the defenders of states' rights and local governance is even worse than that caused by the Supremacy Clause. John Randolph of Roanoke once labeled the Constitution a paper barrier, easily trespassed upon and violated. Within its confines, any number of clauses can be and have been used to justify the most egregious power grabs. Take your pick. The treaty-making clause, the war powers clause, the general welfare clause, or as Randolph warned, all these powers in the aggregate will be invoked to grow the federal leviathan at the expense of the states and the people. If this is true, that the Constitution brought forth a governing order not seen since the High Middle Ages, it has proven even more correct that the Constitution, in the words of Patrick Henry, squints at monarchy. The parchment barriers erected against monarchy and consolidation, primarily the separation of powers in the Bill of Rights, are only as effective as the force which backs them. In this age of the surveillance state, star chamber proceedings, and black budgets, and the flouting of any rule of law by our politicians and their financial backers, how is it that Henry was not right? It's a very good question. I think you can't say he wasn't. And then, of course, Dr. Devaney says this, the constitutional order framed in Philadelphia might well be the result of a great American defect, impatience. At the Virginia State Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry pleaded for due time for careful deliberation. It was not forthcoming. And it is significant that the champions of the Constitution, especially Edmund Randolph, made the argument in favor of haste. When the Second War of Independence, the war between the states, ended in the defeat of the secessionists, what Henry and Randolph envisioned came to pass, an American imperium of consolidated and omnipresent government. A Lincolnian America. Lincolnian nationalism. When the Constitution was going through debate in Philadelphia, and it was proposed that we should have a federal negative of state law, John Rutledge of South Carolina said that alone ought to damn the Constitution. No one would have stood for it, and if they knew what we would have gotten today, they wouldn't have ratified the document. That's the important thing to take away from all the discussions about the Constitution. And I remember I gave a talk one time about this idea of it was nationalists against federalists. That was the real issue. And an older guy came up and said, no, you're wrong. It's all about large state, small state. And I said, no, that's just not true. That language was used as a way to hide the real issue, which is nationalism and federalism. And you find it in the Philadelphia Convention. You find it. They openly talked about it. The nationalists were defeated, but they ultimately won. And they ultimately won because Alexander Hamilton once Secretary of Treasury, and of course, in his mind, de facto Prime Minister, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, everything. Once Hamilton was in power, he made sure that all the things he swore wouldn't happen, happened. Now, if you go back and you read in the Federalist Essays, you can find where he's hinting that he's going to do some of these things. But the most important part about the Federalist Essays is that they weren't very convincing. In fact, the Constitution was barely ratified in New York, and Hamilton was a one-man wrecking crew at Poughkeepsie, trying to get the Constitution ratified. Of course, one of my favorite stories from that particular event is where John Lansing and Hamilton almost get in a duel, because Lansing says, "Hamilton, you're a liar." Hamilton says, "No, I'm not. Prove it." And so Lansing says, "Well, hey, Yates, get out your notes." Yates gets out his notes, and Yates, for some reason, backs Hamilton, even though the notes proved Lansing was correct about Hamilton lying about state powers and nationalism and these things. And, of course, they almost went to a duel. Lansing backed down. But that's one of my favorite stories from the entire ratification process. Now, on that note, in talking about Alexander Hamilton, our piece on Thursday, Lies and Truths of Nationalism by Paul Yarbrough, gets into this. And he talks about this new book by Rich Lowry, which is going to be on the issue of nationalism. And the disease of nationalism. Now, Lowry doesn't think that. Lowry doesn't think that there is anything wrong with nationalism. Lowry thinks that nationalism is a great savior. And a lot of this has to do with, of course, Donald Trump and his position of make America great again and American nationalism. But what Yarbrough is saying here is that this is really a disease that's taking over even the right. I mean, and it's always been present in the right, particularly if you think that Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt are all on the right. Now, that's pretty funny to me. But of course, what they're trying to do is connect the dots between Donald Trump and a nationalist tradition in America. What I would say about this, and what I have said about this, and what a piece in a magazine coming out in the near future is going to say about this, Eric Foner has really won. And even Yarbrough says that. He says Lowry's views are aligned with Eric Foner. Eric Foner and the progressives have won. If this is what we're calling conservatism, if this is what we're conserving, then Foner's won. So Yarbrough says, such ilk as Lowry love to bring up their heroes, Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, both of whom in their day would make Adam Schiff look like the truth fairy. For an excellent and concise study of Hamilton, of course, he mentions my book, How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America. As far as Lincoln's appellation, he was labeled Honest Abe, not because he was honest, but because of the opposite. Much like the biggest player on the football team was called Tiny. Perhaps an even better comparison would be to a used car salesman called Honest John. An excellent source for the true Lincoln would be most of any Thomas DiLorenzo's extensive studies on the subject, or even the musings of Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon. These are great. I also like William Marvel's Mr. Lincoln Goes to War. It's fun. I mean, look, Mr. Lincoln Goes to War is one of the best revisionist histories of the early phases of the war out there. It's ever been written. It's fantastic. Now, Yarbrough says Lincoln was no more than a law-breaking thug. His conduct in violation of habeas corpus, illegally calling up troops to make war on Americans, and a host of other abuses of law are well documented. This is always defended as his needing to break the law to save the Union, or he did it to free the slaves. Of course, neither of these is true, but it gives pseudo-historians like Lowry a bestseller on Amazon, and it perpetuates the Lincoln myth. Of course, Yarbrough gets into bashing Lowry quite a bit. Look, we're going to review this book because it is important to talk about, because Lowry's making the rounds on conservative media, and everyone's just eating this stuff up. But this is really dangerous for the future, because what nationalism produces, and what the Institute, of course, and saying what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, one of the things we try to do is emphasize the Southern tradition in terms of the political Southern tradition. I mean, we're not playing politics one side against the other, but there is that strain in the Southern tradition of John Randolph and St. George Tucker and John Taylor of Carolina, and of course Thomas Jefferson, and the old Republicans, people like Nathaniel Macon, and on down the line, that said, look, even Supreme Court Justice James I. Riddell, look, people have asked me, who was the best Supreme Court Justice? Well, James I. Riddell was pretty good, because he wasn't, I mean, he was a nationalist, but he was reserved. Philip Pendleton Barber was a pretty good Supreme Court Justice from Virginia. Of course, he dies while on the bench. So, the fact is, we have this Southern political tradition of decentralization, and it's at odds with nationalism. In fact, if you go back and you read when Hamilton proposed all of his nationalist schemes, the Congress took them up, it was generally Southerners who opposed them. Generally Southerners. There were Northerners against it, but generally Southerners spoke out against these plans. And I reviewed a book for the Abbeville Institute, the first Congress, and it was horrible because, I mean, look, everything that people like Fisher Ames said in defense of nationalism was great, and everything that the Southerners did was, I mean, these people were just shrill, essentially. They just had no leg to stand on. There's demagoguing. There's nothing to it. Well, of course, these Southerners are pointing out, wait a second here. Even James Madison at this point, pointing out, hey, this is not the Constitution we ratified. I mean, it might have been the one that we wanted. It might have been the one that he even argued for. But it wasn't the one they ratified. So they needed to be very careful about this. Of course, that's not the case. But I like this piece because, again, it hits at this idea of nationalism, and nationalism as the enemy of the Southern tradition. It really is. American nationalism is a creation developed over time, in particular the post-World War II world. A lot of things that we consider to be quote-unquote patriotic today were invented in the post-World War II world. And if you follow my personal podcast, The Brian McClanahan Show, I discussed that in an episode recently, how World War II screwed up America. And of course, a lot of people said, no, it's World War I. Well, I talk about that in the show. I mean, look, World War I led to World War II, but the excessive nationalism we get from World War II is where we are today. I mean, Trump is essentially living in this post-World War II world of American nationalism. It's what Rich Lowry is living in. It's what all these neoconservatives are living in. It's what all of the nationalists on the left are living in as well. I mean, they trumpet Franklin Roosevelt, his second Bill of Rights. I mean, all this stuff. We're living in a post-World War II world, or even a World War II world during World War II. I mean, this is where we are. It was a cataclysmic event for everything, but particularly tradition. Tradition is going to be under assault because of World War II. And one of the things, of course, about tradition, you look at American tradition, it was decentralization. It was this idea of state powers and local government. All of that is under assault because of World War II. All of that is under assault because of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the byproduct of the war, which was a tremendous amount of nationalism. And look, it was the exception rather than the rule in American history, where Americans rallied around the war like they had never done before. In fact, no other war saw it like this. World War I had large pockets of opposition. Spanish-American War. Of course, the War for Southern Independence. The Mexican War, the War of 1812, the American War for Independence, all of these wars had substantial opposition before World War II. Post-World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, War in the Gulf. I mean, all these things, of course, also have substantial opposition. World War II really is the exception, which is why you can say it did so much to damage American psyche and to ingrain this Hamiltonian nationalism into America. And what has that done? Well, it has helped destroy the Southern tradition. Now, my piece that I wrote on Monday is about that. It's about these elections we just had in Virginia and how the Democrats have now taken power in Virginia. And that it's only a matter of time before they probably produce legislation that will seek to take down Confederate monuments and symbols and other things. I mean, this is part of their agenda. Whether it's good or bad, I mean, there are Republicans who support these things too. This is a nonpartisan issue in many ways. Now, we know that the people of Virginia, right now, the majority probably favor keeping them up, but it's only a matter of time, I think. This is where what we're looking at across the South before some of these things start happening. People are talking about Georgia moving in that direction, maybe North Carolina, Virginia certainly. Probably not going to happen in Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina anytime soon. But that doesn't mean it won't happen in other places. So the question is, what do we do about it? Well, this is what we're doing about it. We're talking about it. More people are becoming interested in this, in the Southern tradition, and what the Southern tradition offers. It's not just, look, Dr. Livingston and I have had this conversation several times. So you could take down all the monuments. You could take down all the symbols, and the Southern tradition would still exist. Why? Because as Ben Jones, Cooter, emailed me the other day and said, we have a beautiful culture. A beautiful culture. And I think that's important to note. Of course, there are ways to hang on to that culture in that society. And it's important to note that the South is not just a fabrication, as Drew Gilpin Faust believes. It's not just something that was made up on the go, on the fly, but it was something that was real and tangible. The book review we published on Tuesday is from an old book. It's an old review published in 1982 originally. It's by James Thompson, and it covers Michael O'Brien's book, which was, when I was in graduate school, essential reading, The Idea of the American South. And it's a 20th century look at the American South, 1920 to 1941. And Michael O'Brien is a Brit. And essentially he says, again, this is all made up. And Thompson takes him to task. Thompson says that this is just a bunch of hogwash. The South, of course, exists. Of course, it's real. There is a Southern and a Southernness. There's a South. Now, he says there's problems with this definition at times because you don't have a South that's always clearly identifiable. But of course, the South exists because people say it exists. And Thompson correctly brings up, he says, one of the major shortcomings of O'Brien's book needs to be mentioned. O'Brien deliberately bypasses the poetry of Ransom, Tate, and Davidson because it has been thoroughly worked over by such literary scholars as Lewis Rubin. But does that justify omission on such poems as Antique Harvesters, Ode to the Confederate Dead, Lee in the Mountains? And what of Alan Tate's splendid novel, The Fathers, also ignored by O'Brien? No discussion of the idea of the South can be adequate when he lades the most carefully wrought and fallacious expression of that idea. O'Brien's own words serve to indict him. It may seem that I am trying to perform Hamlet without the prince. You have to cover these people if you're going to talk about 1920 to 1941. And of course, they struggled to define these things. As Donald Davidson wrote, the South is a land still fought for, even in retreat. Thompson says, once again, as in the years before the Civil War, the South suffered the barbs of journalists, scholars, and politicians from the 1920s and 30s. This forced young Southerners to reassess their relationship to their native soil, a land they had taken for granted. I think this is what we're seeing right now. We're in the same situation. A land taken for granted. I'm not so certain the South has as much fight in it today, which is why what's happening in Virginia is so strange. I mean, only 65% of North Carolinians want to keep Confederate monuments up. When you say, well, that's a lot, 65%, it should be 95%. But it shows you what's happening in the South. Only 65%. That number, unfortunately, will probably continue to go down over the next 20 to 30 years. And then what happens? Now, of course, all of this is very clearly a cultural war. And as more and more people move into the South from either the North or other countries, demographics are going to displace native Southerners. Southern culture, the Southern tradition, all of that's going to change. And it's important to note that we are trying to hang on to these things. And the last piece of the week by Jim Peterson, What Religious Statistics Can Tell Us About the War Between the States, it shows very conclusively. I love this piece. It gets in the weeds in some cases, but it shows that there was a distinctive North and South based on religion as well. It was not, there was something deeper and really spiritually tangible here that kept the North and South at odds in the antebellum period, even into the 20th century. And he has wonderful charts and displays to show how this all worked. This is David Hackett Fisher getting into culture, the importance of culture and identity. Southern culture and identity existed more than just on the race and slavery issue. And I think this is where we get so caught up. This is why I said Eric Foner is one, because if you listen to people like Lowry and others, I mean, the South is just slave owners. It's just racist. There's nothing to it. These people are oligarchic. These are the neoconservatives. This is what they say about the South. And the South was the enemy that deserved to be punished and defeated. What we needed were good Republicans bringing democracy and nationalism to the South. And we just occupied the South longer and gave them good national government. They would have come out all right. But we didn't do that. So Reconstruction was a failure. That, of course, is Eric Foner talking. But speaking through the neoconservatives. The Southern tradition is the antithesis of nationalism. The Southern tradition is rooted in place and people and custom. The agrarians wrestled with it because it was hard to identify what it was. There is no ideology in it. You can't have, it's very hard to identify something that doesn't have roots in ideology because we exist in that world. A proposition nation, ideology. This is socialism, fascism, liberalism, conservative. We exist in this world. But that's all ideology. The tradition itself, the Southern tradition, is not ideology. It's just people. It's generation upon generation. It's Chesterton's fence. It's land. It's custom. And it's not to say these things don't exist in other places, but certainly the South respects tradition more, I think, than just about any other people in the United States. You can say that there's groups, American Indian tribes, they certainly respect tradition. There's religious groups that do. But in the South, those that really identify with it. And it's unfortunate that now it's seen as kind of a, lower class thing to do. To wave the Confederate flag or to support. This is just for hillbillies and blue collar people. We have to understand that many of the people who supported those things for a long time were not hillbilly blue collar people, and there's nothing wrong with hillbilly blue collar people. They're great, but the leaders, those with money and those with political power, were waving those things and supporting those things for a long period of time. I always point back when I live in a town that was well known for crime and corruption, and back in 1954, one of the men in that town was elected Attorney General of the state. He was going to clean up that corruption. He was shot dead before he could even be sworn in. But when you go back and listen to he canvassed the entire state, looking to get votes, and he won by a slim majority. Only slim majority because of voter fraud and corruption. But when you look at his speeches, and there's a wonderful speech he made, he emphasizes, he points out all of his Confederate ancestors because that was important. It was a lineage. Now, no one would do that today, but he was showing that he was a true Southerner, and that he spoke from the South. Regardless of whether you were left or right, progressive or not in the South, that was something that everyone hung, okay, this is a real Southerner. They're just speaking from the South, from a different view of the South, but from the South itself. That's why when you look at Devaney's piece and Yarborough's piece and Peterson's piece and Thompson's piece, when you talk about the South still existing and what is Southern culture, what do these things offer? Well, when we talk about what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, one of those, the most valuable thing, of course, is that continuity between generations. When Faulkner said, I sound paraphrasing, but the past isn't even the past. This is true in the South. That continuity between generations is key to understanding Southerners and the Southern people. And all of that is what's under attack. Until next time, good day.